Good evening. My name is Gary Rembes, and people a lot of times would ask me, how did you get into this? Well, what happened was I was given an offer I couldn't refuse in 2009, so I retired. And I said, easy enough to get a job because I never had problems getting a job. And after a year or so of this, my wife said, you're under my feet too much, so do something else. So I decided to go back to school. And one of the school classes, I had to go to Gettysburg because it was a Civil War battlefield class. And then the guy said, well, you know, there was these 24th Michigan dudes and whatnot, okay. But then I started volunteering at the Plymouth Historical Museum, and there's a little display there about the 24th Michigan. Well, I did get my master's degree, and I was doing some work, and I thought, you know, geez, why don't I write a little bit of a paper about the 24th? Well, 31 pages later, and I'm not even out of boot camp. So I proceeded to write this book. This book is available here at the Livonia Civic Center Library, at the Plymouth Library, the Canton Library, the Northville Library, the Dearborn Library, the Redford Library, and a couple of other places. And the reason that I got into it was I got to travel with my daughter. Now, if you have daughters, you know what it's hard to get them to want to go any place with you. So I was lucky enough that we did a lot of research on this. Anyway, when I started, after I completed the book, I was asked to do a presentation at a Civil War roundtable. And I thought, geez, what am I going to talk about? These guys are a lot smarter than me. They know a lot more than me. During the presentation, I am going to talk about what they did, but I'm going to more talk about also what they had to go through, what they ate, what they drank, where they went, how they were clothed and all. So with that, I will get into this. Now remember, the people of the Civil War period, they weren't really that much different than what we are. You know, they liked to laugh, they liked to live, they had their own love affairs, they cried, they died. They liked to sing, they liked to dance. There are just so many similarities, but you take a look at some of the other things, they were still very different from us in a lot of ways. For example, the temperance movement just started making its way. Women's rights just started making its way a little bit. And even the African Americans up north were not treated the way that you would expect them because they were free men. They couldn't vote, they couldn't sit on juries, they couldn't even testify. And a lot of the places, they had separate seating in the theaters and churches. So I'll get into this right now. I'm talking about the 24th Michigan Infantry. It was called the Wayne County Brigade. They became part of the elite kind of shock troops of the Iron Brigade. And the Iron Brigade was the 1st Brigade of the 1st Division of the 1st Corps. That little red moon in the middle over there was their insignia. So you could see them and you knew who they were. Some of the engagements of the 24th were Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Fitzhugh's Crossing, Gettysburg. That was really a mark. They had Mine Run, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Laurel Hill, the Salient, Cold Harbor, Petersburg, and the Weldon Railway. And through happenstance, they became honor guard at President Lincoln's funeral. Now, here's how it all started. There was a rally in Detroit in the summer of 1862. And Lewis Cass, who is this gentleman right here, this does work. He was making a speech and he was saying, you know, we should draft a resolution. Draft a resolution? You mean you're going to draft men into the Army? Well, those of you who may be close to my age may remember Vietnam and everything that we went through about talking about the draft. Well, the people of Detroit and Wayne County were a little bit ashamed. They wanted to form a regiment of their own. Well, Governor Blair, he was assigned to do 6 more regiments. I can't add another one to that, but fortunately he had a wife who talked him into it. Now, while all of the commotion was going on, this gentleman here, Sheriff Mark Flanagan, about 6'4" or 5", 220 pounds, he had 2 revolvers out, and he had 2 deputies with him, also with revolvers. And as they started threatening Lewis Cass, I said, "You want to come up? I'll shoot you and anybody else until my bullets run out." Well, that kind of calmed them down a little bit. So Lewis Cass was friends with this gentleman over here, Henry Morrow, who became colonel of the 24th. Henry Morrow happened to be a Virginian. He was a good friend of Lewis Cass. And Lewis Cass, when he was in the Senate, talked him into coming into Michigan. Now, just a little thing about Lewis Cass. He was governor, I believe he was a senator, and he was Secretary of State under James Buchanan. Give you a little bit of statistics about the guys. When they left Detroit, there was 1,037 of them, including officers. It was a volunteer regiment. And what volunteer meant at that time is the governor got to appoint the colonel, the lieutenant colonel, and the major. And when you take a look at the other officers, they were elected by the men in the company. The captain was elected, the first lieutenant, second lieutenant were elected, and they even elected their sergeants and their corporals. The average age in this regiment was 25 years, 2 months. And I'll get about where they're going. Now here's where they came from. The majority of them, 479, came from Wayne County. 428 came from Detroit. And hence it was a Wayne County regiment that was there. I'd like to bring this up. Nankin, anybody know what Nankin became? You're right, Westland. Now, here's the average ages of the Union soldier. He was 5 feet, 8.5 inches tall, and 143.5 pounds. Last time I weighed 143 pounds, I was a junior in high school. Had brown hair, blue eyes, and a light complexion. 75% of them were born in America. And about half of them were farmers and mechanics, laborers. But one thing I do want to point out here, the average age was 25. That means half of them were under 25. And when you're under 25, typically you're still growing. So it kind of distorted the age or the weight a little bit too. Well, here's something that they encountered. This is the Minie Ball. It's 58 caliber. Over here is a 44 caliber, just to do a little bit of comparison, and here is the 32-inch caliber. Caliber means basically inches, decimal inches. This is what it would look like coming at you, respectively. Now, you've probably heard of the expression half-cocked. Well, that was developed during the Civil War because they would cock the gun or their rifle halfway, put on a percussion cap, and then when they were ready to shoot, they'd cock it back all the way. Now, if you fired when it was half-cocked, nothing happened. Here's a little bit of what would happen to you when you got hit by a Minie Ball. I took this at the Civil War Museum in Frederick, Maryland, through a pane of glass. You can see how it came out. But that's the Minie Ball right over here entering a shoulder. So you can see the kind of damage it did. Now, a couple of things that people still don't realize is there was a little bit of grease on the Minie Ball, which attracted a lot of bacteria. When the ball went into you, it went through clothing, which not necessarily was clean. So a lot of infections happened after that. I'll point this out to you. These little things are their percussion caps. And that's what they had to put on that area, that strike it. Here is the cartridge. You notice that they could put 40 cartridges in there, 10 to a pack, and it was double covered. Over here is where they put the percussion caps. Inside of there, they would typically give you 2 extra for every cartridge, so you got 12 for every 10. You can see that it's kind of hard to handle. And over here is what the gunpowder was in. A lot of times, people don't realize how smart they were back then and how they wanted to do a little bit more with repetition. So what you would do in this case, you'd have your rifle here, you'd bite off the cartridge paper, pour the gunpowder in, and when the Minie Ball came out, you pressed it down with your finger. You took out the ramrod, turned it over, and jammed the Minie Ball and gunpowder all the way down. You'd replace the ramrod. Then you'd pick up your rifle to a horizontal position, cock it back, reach in, grab one of those little percussion caps, put it on. Now, while all this was going on, people were shooting at you. You may hear thud, and the guy next to you fell down dead. Or you may hear somebody yell out, they got hit. Then you put it up your shoulder and you fired it. It had a lot more kick than what I perceived the M1 rifle that I fired on a couple of times. So here's some of the stuff that they ate. This is hardtack. Hardtack is made of flour, water, sometimes salt, and baked. Oftentimes bugs would come with it. Well, either you knock the bugs off or you didn't eat. What they would do oftentimes is put it in their hot coffee, skim the bugs off the top. Now, government contractors were giving canned coffee all ground up. But if you can believe it, some of them would put sand or dirt into it. So they kind of put a stop to that. And they went to the coffee bean. Some of them had grinders, but typically what they would do is put a little bit in a little sack and use the butt of their rifle to break it all up, drop it into the coffee container, which was large, and they would boil it. When it was through boiling, it was done. Then they dropped the hardtack in. Over here is salt pork. Kind of between Canadian bacon and what we have as bacon too. They had a lot of canned goods here that you can see, beans, and then condensed milk, Borden's and Carnation. One thing I stumbled across that I'm not sure that they had during the Civil War, but I thought was worth a smile, is you could get cream possum with sweet potatoes in coon gravy. Now, I was in the Springfield Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum there, and this gentleman happened to be there, and I took his pictures. And what you're seeing over here is at attention, getting able to march, but typically the rifle was turned in the other direction, and you marched at 60 steps a minute. And then you did the quick, which means you were going to be running a little bit, and you had to do 110 steps a minute. And the double quick, they would balance the rifle, and they had to do 160 steps a minute. Here are some of the things that they wore. There's 2 major rifles, a British one called the 1851 Enfield, and then the 1861 Springfield. What you're looking at here is his haversack. It was canvas, it was painted black, and on the inside of that was a liner. Again, it was made out of wool, so they could wash it and be a little bit cleaner. Now, they typically would take 3 days' ration, sometimes more, and they would jam it in the haversack. Some of these guys are pretty hungry and a little bit lazy, because what they would do is eat it all, or eat as much as they could, so they wouldn't have to carry it. The canteen itself is made out of metal with a cork stopper. Now you notice it's covered. The reason it was covered is if you got the cover of the canteen wet, it kept the contents cooler a little longer. You can see here his bayonet. Here's what he carried on his back. This here is his blanket, roughly about 3 feet by 6 feet, maybe a little bit longer. Here is a scarf that he packed just for extras, and they had a rubber pad that they would lay on the ground so the moisture wouldn't get through. And this, what you see here, is a half of a tent. Over here, what we're looking at is his coffee cup. It was used for soups, stews, and whatnot, after all. I should have pointed out, I'll back it up one page a little bit, but this area right here, that's where they kept the percussion caps. Bringing forward, the container over here was their cartridge box. Here's what the tent setup looked like. They had a partner. The black thing over is the rubber mat that they would use, and you could see you had to have 2 buddies, 2 partners. Oftentimes when they couldn't find poles or they didn't carry the poles, they would put the bayonet on the rifle, stick it into the ground, and then put a rope across so they could have their tent. Now I want to contrast that a little bit with the Southern soldier. Basically, he had a lot of the same things, but he had a blanket that he carried across his shoulder like that. And the reason he did that is because if he got wounded on the battlefield, he'd get warm. The other thing that could happen is he would, if he got wounded bad and you were looking for somebody to create a stretcher, you could roll a couple of rifles into the blanket and make a stretcher of yourself. They didn't have a rubber pad to lay on, but they were given sometimes oilcloth. And and people over here may be old enough to remember what an oilcloth is. Now, some other things that they would carry. They would have, obviously, their straight razor, soap, and a shaving brush. But a lot of the soldiers wouldn't shave. I mean, what for? I mean, there's no girls around to impress. And hot water was a little bit hard to come by. One thing that I did find interesting was this issue. Some of them were issues, some this. You notice you got a fork on one end, a spoon on the other end, and together it was folded into the butter knife and it looked like that. Almost all of them carried a Bible or a New Testament or a hymnal book. What this is over here is what they call the housewife. And then it was needles, thread, buttons, patches that they would use. And when they would go into the suitor, which was designated by the government, had to go through, there he could buy candles, soap, brushes, combs, and so on. The thing that surprised me was they were also issued toothbrushes, and I think it was baking powder that they used to brush their teeth with. Another thing that I came across that I was a little fascinated about was the fuses. They were 4 seconds long. And what that did was you had case shot, which had like shrapnel in it, and you put the fuse in, and that would cut it off. You had a table over here that would tell you what elevation, how far to expect it to shoot, and the explosion that you could have. I always thought this was a friction cap. It replaced the flint that came out of the lanyard, and I always thought, well, they had some sort of a wick. Well, this friction primer was used for starting to spark that would go in there. Now here's kind of the smoke and fire that came out of that cannon. They had basically three types of cannonballs, if you will. One was a solid shot. That was predominantly used to knock out the enemy's cannon or his limber. They had a case shot, which was hollow, filled with round metal balls. They had a shell shot that was, a lot of times had just shrapnel in it. And then they had canister. Now canister was anywhere between a half an inch to 1 inch long, and when it came out, exploded. What surprised me when I was doing research was it all came tied together. You had your sack of gunpowder. You had what they called a duck, which was a low wooden plate over there. And then you had the actual canister or shell or solid shot coming out. And it was all banded together. So they would grab it and load it. The guy that would grab the cartridge always kept his back to the enemy, because if he had his gunpowder facing the enemy, imagine what would happen if he got hit in the gunpowder area. Now there was predominantly two types of cannon that was used. You had the brass Napoleons. They were probably accurate enough, half a mile, maybe a little bit more. And then you had the rifled Parrott cannon. The difference, the way a reenactor explained it to me, is with one of those 12-pound Napoleons, you could hit a house about a half mile away with some certainty. With a Parrott, you could pick what window you'd wanted it in. And the way this was demonstrated to me was, I was taking a tour of the Antietam battlefield. And what the guy said, he said, well, General Lee on horseback and General Longstreet and A.P. Hill got together in this area that they were planning the strategy for the battle. And then a cannon was shot, and it blew the front legs off A.P. Hill's horse. So it just kind of demonstrates the accuracy that they could have. Now, back to our 24th. They started their boot camp on the 15th of August, and on the 29th, they left for Washington. They figured they were trained enough boot camp that they were going to fight the rebels. Well, guess what happens when they walked into D.C.? If you're in the Army, you knew, you hurried up and waited. Some of them had an opportunity to visit Mount Vernon and take tours of Washington, D.C. itself. And then they found out, geez, we're going to be assigned to the elite battle of battalion of the battle-hardened Iron Brigade, 1st Brigade, 1st Division, 1st Corps. Well, while they were waiting for their assignment, I stumbled across this in a letter from George Gordon to his wife. The currency was easy enough copied. So what the Southerners did is they printed out one of these with facsimile over here to help the merchants identify what's a real and what is not. So guess what the soldiers would do? They'd grab one of these, tear off the part that says facsimile, and they spent the money. Now I want to talk about slavery a little bit, but the reason that the North really got involved in the war was somebody fired on Fort Sumter. How dare they? And if you read the Articles of Confederation, 3 times in there it said that the Union was to be perpetual. Slavery, as far as the South was concerned, that was the primary reason for secession. And the way they looked at it was 4 states, Texas, Georgia, South Carolina, and Mississippi, very specifically stated in their Articles of Secession was because of slavery. In the Confederate Constitution, they said slavery 9 different times. And when the gentleman introduced the Article of Secession to the Congress in Alabama, he mentioned slavery again. So you also had a little bit of a dilemma going on over here because there were 4 slave states that were kind of neutral: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. And sometimes I kind of look at them and I say, you know, was that what you were fighting for, the right to have slaves? Well, you take a look at a couple of things that I did stumble across. I had a man by the name of John C. Calhoun. He was very much in favor of the peculiar institution. He came up with nullification. Well, if a slave escaped up north into Michigan, what they felt, you know, this is Michigan. We're a free state. You come in here, you're free. Now, the South sometimes contradicted themselves because, you know, our slaves escaped over there. Federal government, you got to get involved. So it was a little bit of a contradiction on both sides. After the Battle of Antietam, there was Lincoln wanted to issue the Emancipation Proclamation almost right away, but his cabinet convinced him to wait. And it was issued effective January 1st, 1863. Now, a couple of things with the Emancipation Proclamation. It did not free all slaves. It only freed those slaves that were in territory that was in rebellion. So those part of Virginia, where it was occupied, the people there could, by the Union forces, the people there could keep their slaves. The other thing that it did was, all of a sudden, if you were an African American, whether you're a slave or not, you could join the Union Army. So about 85% of all the African Americans that were eligible joined the Union Army, and 80% probably, or 3/4 of that percentage, were former slaves. That gave a boost of the Union Army by about another 200,000 people. Now, going back to our friends in the 24th, here they are standing up nice and proud. Boy, they picked me to be with this elite Iron Brigade. You know, how do they know all about me? And they were very proud of themselves. And Colonel Morrow was giving a little bit of a speech saying, oh, we're happy to be involved with you guys and being in this brigade, and we're going to do our best to live up to your reputation and all. Iron Brigade just stood there, hands folded, not paying any attention. Colonel Morrow was through with his speech. They just turned and walked away. Now, the big reason for that is they thought that these men were bounty men, which they got paid $300 to take somebody's place, or they were draftees. Little did they know. Well, the first battle came at Fredericksburg. And prior to that, at South Mountain, they saw the 17th Michigan cross a bit of a stream, get between 2 stone walls, and captured a lot of the Confederates over there and did a lot of harm. They became known as the Stonewall Regiment. Now we got to live up to that. Well, when they got into the battle at Fredericksburg, they thought that they were facing Jeb Stuart's cavalry and Stonewall Jackson's foot cavalry. So during the course of the battle, before anything really happened of any substance, before they even fired a shot, one of the captain's sons had his head blown off. No head, bleeding. Another one got hit in the arm and had his arm blown off. So these guys got a little bit squirmish about what was going to do. So Colonel Morrow tried to calm them down. And what he did is he made them go through the manual of arms. And then there's these 3 Wisconsin regiments and 1 Indiana regiment looking at, these guys are crazy. They're the bravest people I have ever run across. Well, they fought, and at the battle they lost 36 casualties, 7 dead. The whole other Iron Brigade regiments had a total of 33 casualties. Now, one thing happened over here that had some significance for us here in Wayne County. There was 2 brothers, Barney and John Liggett. Well, they happened to be the maternal uncles of a guy by the name of Henry Ford. Now, they would develop nicknames for each other. Initially, the Iron Brigade, before they were named that, were called the Bandbox Brigade because of their white gloves and leggings that they had to wear. And then they called the 2nd Wisconsin Raggedy Ass. Well, they were one of the first ones into the Civil War. They were at the first Battle of Manassas, and their clothes were worn. The 6th Wisconsin was called the Calico 6 because of their shirts, and you didn't have to wear a regulation Army shirt or King's Babies. Huckleberries was for the 7th Wisconsin. They always found a way of finding pies and food and such. Now, the 19th Indiana was called the Swamp Hogs. They said they didn't smell so good, but they sure knew how to fight. And the 24th Michigan was called the Featherbedders. Brand new uniforms, brand new everything. There were other nicknames that I stumbled across was the Fighting Butterflies of the 5th New Jersey Cavalry. The reason they were named that was they had very fancy uniforms. The second one that I smiled on was the silk stockings for the 7th New York, and then we know about the Highlander and Irish Brigades, Orange Blossom Brigade, Bucktails, so on. Now, they participated in Burnside's famous march. Well, what happened was Fredericksburg was over. Go get them. You better go after these guys. And that was the politicians back in Washington, including Lincoln, and the newspapers. It's still good out. So what happened was he decided to try and outflank General Lee. The first morning, it wasn't too bad walking. The next day, it started snowing and raining. Roads were made out of dirt. Dirt, when it gets wet, becomes mud. And as they started marching farther and farther, it got worse and worse. Do you ever step in a mud hole and try and pull your shoe out without your foot coming out? These guys had mud going up to almost their knees. 16 horses couldn't pull a limber in a canyon. And it got so bad that the mud came up to the bottom of the, not cannon, but the bed of the, whatever I'm going to use for there. So they settled down in winter quarters. The winter quarters were called shacks or shebangs. What they did was they dug a hole approximately 10 by 12, 8 by 10, about a foot, foot and a half deep. They put up the poles, they nailed other logs together, filled it with mud, or they cut down trees and made their own planks that way. For the roof, they used their tents. So you can see they're pretty ingenious. And if they were able to get a hold of some worn out harnesses, they would use that for hinges for their doors. Some things they would do for fun, they would get into snowball fights by company or by regiment. And some of them even put in a rock in that snowball. Now remember, these were still young kids, some of them 15, 16 years old. So, you know, they're in there and they got a nice fire burning, so what would happen if I put a board over the chimney? Well, the smoke backed up and they ran out of the shack, and you know, the guys that were doing it laughed. The other thing that they might do is drop a cartridge in. Bang! You'd hear that go off. You'd take off of there as soon as you could. And come springtime, they learned a new game called baseball. So a lot of similarity to what we have today, but still a little different. And if you remember when you were a teenager, did anybody ever make up their own lyrics to songs that they may have heard? Well, the boys did the same thing. This better work, Kyle. The Union version of Dixie.
They will all go down to Dixie, away, away. Each Dixie boy must understand that he must mind his uncles and obey.
Well, I think that's enough of that. But they also had a little bit of banter going back and forth. First of all, they would say, hey, Billy Yank, how'd y'all like Manassas? The retort would be about as much as you like South Mountain. And then the Yanks would say, why are you wearing those raggedy clothes? Ain't you got nothing better? Well, they come back, well, we don't wear our good clothes to butcher hogs. Hey, Yank, what happened to your fighting Joe Hooker? Well, he's attending Stonewall Jackson's funeral. One of the big significant things, battles, was at Fitzhugh's Crossing. Now, Lee would like to put a river between, or a big stream between him and the Union. So there'd be a bit of a slope that you'd have to climb up. And behind that slope, he had the people do rifle pits or trenches. And in front of those, they would chop down trees or logs, and they would sharpen the end of the branches facing towards the enemy. Or if they were really lucky, they had a stone wall to have behind. So while they, the 26th or 24th Michigan and the 6th Wisconsin were told, go across the river in boats, take care of the enemy. So they started paddling across. Now imagine this. These guys are, with their muskets, they're shooting at them. But we had sharpshooters on the other side that could fire back at them and pick them off. Typically, the angle of the cannon was a little bit too high for an effective shot going directly at them. Well, they captured Cannon and men from the 20th Alabama and the 6th Louisiana. The 6th Louisiana was part of the Louisiana Tigers, another very fierce, famous regiment of the South. And then they captured 200 prisoners. And while these prisoners were coming in, the Rebs remembered them. You guys weren't scared of nothing. Now, I want you to take a look at this guy here in the middle. Remember him. Here you can see the leggings that they wore. The strange thing about it is the 2nd Wisconsin was the only one that had dark blue pants. The other ones had the light blue. You notice the infantry guys had it pinned up on the right side. I'm sorry, on the left side. But the officers did something a little bit different. They pinned it up on the opposite side. Now, I swear that this guy could have been related to that other guy because he looks a lot the same. But anyway, the 24th Michigan had their forage caps. They had their shell jacket. The difference being here, this was pretty fancy. You see the piping that they had there on the frock coats? But to save money, they never bothered hemming the frock coats. Prior to Gettysburg, these are some pictures of actual men of the 24th. Unfortunately, nobody copied down their names. These are reenactors at Gettysburg. If you see over here, you can see that big red moon. And on the bottom, I just wanted to put all of this together. They would have a lot of reunions and get together. Gettysburg was a watershed for the 24th Michigan and the Iron Brigade. This is, legend has it saying, Colonel Morrow was injured, and he ran across General Ewell, and General Ewell says to him, you know, you guys could have surrendered, saved a lot of lives, saved a lot of suffering. Colonel Morrow said to retort, General Ewell, the 24th came to fight, not to surrender. I'm going to talk a little bit more than I probably should about Gettysburg, but they marched that morning about 6 miles. General Buford and his cavalry were holding off some rebel troops. The ground that they went into was kind of manicured. They had cows grazing there, and that's what I'm trying to display over here. This is actual growth in Gettysburg. It was not like that. And if you look over their shoulders, there was a cornfield, and you can make out the seminary here. Here's what the battle looked like. The Iron Brigade came up against them. The 6th Wisconsin here was held and reserved, and you notice the 24th Michigan was able to flank them. You wanted to flank the enemy, because when you flank the enemy, you could fire in behind them. And imagine, bullets come to front of you, bullets coming from the back of you. It caused a little bit of a panic. So they retreated. And during that battle, probably lasted until 10, 11 o'clock maybe in the morning, they captured the first Confederate general. Now, as they were going through the woods, this gentleman here, the Color Sergeant Peck, he was from Westland or Nankin, right? He was the first guy to get hit with a bullet right in the forehead, carrying the flag. Here is there's a map over there. And once they realized who they were fighting, the rebels would say, it's them damn black hats in the whole army of the Potomac. Ain't no militia. Here is Willoughby Run. Another education for me. I found out a run is a stream. And right about here is where they encountered the 26th North Carolina, who, by the way, were extremely well armed, extremely well dressed. Their Governor Vance saw to it. 14 color bearers tried to cross the stream. 14 of them were either killed or wounded. They had 3 more stands in the woods. The rebels kept coming after them. And the next slide over here is a view across towards Herbst Woods, and this was the open ground. They could see 2, 3 battle lines of rebels coming after them. They were getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, if you turned around, this was the Lutheran Seminary, which was right behind them. Now, these are some reenactors at Greenfield Village, just firing around. A lot of times it became so smoky that you had to bend down to look for legs so you could try and identify a place to fire at. Or you've seen the flash of a rifle when they let off their bullet and you try to go after that. Here is the Union side doing it. And they said that, you know, if you were really good, you would fire and load 3 times in a minute, every 20 seconds. Seems pretty fast when you're trying to do it to a rifle. But imagine all the smoke that was created after 4 or 5 minutes. What they would usually do is say, well, you know, we're going to fire by file, or we're going to fire, one will step in front of the other, kneel, fire, and so on. Here are some reenactors with the cannon. Now, I'm showing this to show you, I'll be discussing some of these things a little bit later. And you can see the little difference over here. You notice in the Army, just sort of subtleties would identify different things for you. The infantry was a light blue, and they had that in the cord around their head. The artillery was red, and the cavalry was a yellow or a gold. So after they got orders that they could retreat, they came into the square in the city of Gettysburg, and they turned the corner. This is the southeast corner that turned around to. They made a wrong turn. Rebels were coming in after them. So what they did, nobody was there directing traffic. That you should go this way to Cemetery Hill. So they had to follow the dead bodies, the wounded, the dropped muskets, the dropped knapsacks, and so far. This was more than a quarter mile out of town. This is what the cemetery gates were like. This area right over here was a house, and that was built a little bit later. This gentleman over here is Captain Edwards. Captain Edwards was never wounded in any battle. He lasted the whole war. He was, one of the lucky ones. But 496 men entered the battle that day. He led 26 men and 2 lieutenants back to the Cemetery Hill right over here. The next morning, there was only 99 total. What that means is 80% casualties. 20% were only fit to fire the next day, 99. Now, if you take a look at that and you count 4 people, the next one, the 5th, that was the only one that survived. A couple of things I'd like to point out. Here's a little rendering picture of what they thought the battle would be like on Cemetery Hill. If you take a look at these dead soldiers, most of them are without shoes. Shoes were a big commodity. They wore out. He's dead. He doesn't need them anymore, so he took them. They'd also take shirts, socks, and anything else that they could. And a lot of times they would take pocket watches and any money that they could find on the dead man. Both sides did that. Now, this is the view from Cemetery Hill. Now, inside the cemetery, there was tombstones that they would use for cover. But there was a little sign there saying, there's a $5 fine for anybody firing a gun in this cemetery. I don't believe anybody paid any of the fines. This is how the Baltimore Pike looks today. Back then, it was a little bit tighter, and they would put cannons on either side, because if the rebels tried marching down the middle of the street or even the side of the street, they were fodder. Now, there's been a lot of questioning about General Ewell and how come he didn't attack. If old Stonewall was there, it would have been a lot different. Well, guess what? His men were fighting since around 9 o'clock in the morning, and this was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. They didn't take a lot of time to eat, didn't have a lot to drink, and it was over 90 degrees. The other thing that happened was the men were scattered. He had to get them all together, and he had to develop some sort of diversion. Pretend like you're attacking here, but we're going to really attack over there. And the orders he got from General Lee were a little bit confusing. It said, do not get into any major engagement, but take the hill if practical. What the hell does he want me to do? Then you have the other issue is, what's on the other side of that hill? Is there another 20, 30,000 men? Maybe another 50 cannon? So I'm not going to be too anxious to go up that hill and attack. This is the top of the Fishhook, where the 24th Michigan and the rest of the Iron Brigade were. They did not see a lot of action. This is one of the monuments to the 26th North Carolina. Remember I mentioned that they lost 4 color guards trying to cross that stream? Well, that morning, about 885 men were in the regiment ready to attack. Only 212 made it safely to the next day. They suffered 75% casualties. The 24th Michigan is lucky enough that it had 2 statues or monuments dedicated to them. This is the big one in Herbst Woods. This was found, and this was done in 1886, shortly after about 20 years after the war ended. This is, this plaque over here, this little monument, is for the 24th Michigan, and it's right over here where part of their regiment was. And it says, on 496 men who went into battle, only 99 were able to report for the duty the next day. Here's some additional monuments to the Iron Brigade itself. One thing, if you notice, if you go down Michigan Avenue through Dearborn and follow it out, It's called the Iron Brigade Highway. In September of that year, the brigade was one of the few brigades ever to get their own flag. And you can see this is a woman, I reckon she'd be around 4'8", 4'10", and you can see how big the flag was in relationship to her. Here's a nice little picture of the 24th Michigan in Herbst Woods. You can see Colonel Morrow holding the flag over there. This is what was left of the flag of the 24th. This is the other side of this side, or this side is the other side of that. This is what the 26th North Carolina flag was like. And you read a thing, well, the part of the flag that was torn off, the North Carolinians picked it up and they put it in a museum in Raleigh, North Carolina. Well, I found out that it was not true. I did some chasing, and the 24th flag was made out of silk by a company by the name of Tiffany. Any remnants that they had were made out of wool. The morning after, this is what Captain Edwards wrote. And it's saying, I congratulate you, brave soldiers, on your splendid achievement of July 1st. A single division held up an army. The achievement of which you may feel proud, the enemy's dead in front of you, attests to your valor and glory. Our joy in the glory of our arms is mingled with the sadness and heroic deed on the field of honor. Let the memory of those lamented comrades inspire your hearts with a new life and zeal to emulate their heroic virtues. Day 2, let's attack Culps Hill. You can see Culps Hill was not exactly good terrain for rebels to attack from. I don't think that the officers really reconnoitered the area enough, but you can see it was high, uphill. They had a lot of boulders and a lot of obstructions in their area. Once they got to the top of the hill, there was a bit of a barricade over there and a 6-inch hole that the Union would use to fire their rifles from. Now, that additional branch was there to protect their foreheads and engage their life. This is kind of a famous guy over there, is Father Corby. He was blessing the Iron Brigade or anybody who wanted it before they went into the wheat field. Father Corby was born here in Detroit, and he became president of a university in Indiana called Notre Dame. Wheat field, there was a lot of blood shed there, as well as the peach orchard. What I did not mention, and it was hard to demonstrate, General Sickles took his corps and they went to the next hill, figuring it was safer and better there. Well, that broke the Union line. Now, Longstreet was going to attack, and he's saying, which flank do I attack? Do I attack the end of Sickles' line, or do I go from the Round Top? This is Devil's Den, and it was called the Devil's Den long before the Battle of Gettysburg. Here's what the little Round Top looks like today. Now, a lot of people say, well, you know, if the rebels would have taken a little Round Top, that would have been, you know, terrible, and it could have changed the course of the war. Well, we all know the story about the 20th Maine and General Chamberlain running out of ammunition and charging Barclay and a few of the other rebels. Well, what they failed to mention also is the 16th Michigan was also with them, as well as the 44th New York and 83rd Pennsylvania. Here I wanted to point out the rifles that they did use. This is the Cavalry. And the 1st, 5th, 6th, and 7th became part of the Wolverine Brigade, which was newly promoted from Captain General Custer. Now, one thing I want to point out is their red ties that they would use. Custer wore it into the battle, and because the men started developing great respect for him, he was barely 26 years old, and he was in command of them, so they did that. Now, I always thought that they would take out their sabers and do a cavalry charge and fight each other with their swords. Well, that wasn't necessarily true. They had revolvers. Now, do you want to use a saber against the guy, or do you want to use a revolver? Oftentimes, they would have 2 revolvers, lanterns around their necks, and use those. They would sometimes ride into battle with a shotgun or rifles. Now, this was part of General Lee's plan. Jeb Stuart showed up late on Thursday night, which was the 2nd of July. He was tired, but you know, you got a lot of excuses. The cavalry that was chasing them was tired too. They were just as much worn out. But the plan was for Stuart to go behind the lines, and after they got through bombarding them, attack the rear end of the line. What they decided to do is at 1 o'clock, 151 cannon opened up. And then we had to, or the Yankees had to answer back with them. Imagine the noise that that created. Some say you could hear it in Harrisburg, Baltimore, and even Washington, D.C. Now, one thing about this cannonade, you want to call it luck or you want to call it divine providence. Most of the projectiles went over the men and on the other side of the hill. So Lee thinks that he has the line all softened up, ready for a charge. Well, out of the smoke and all comes 13,000 men, 3 battle lines, about a mile wide, marching up. They would get hit with case or shell. They would just close their ranks and keep marching. Imagine the bravery of those guys doing that. And they were not allowed to fire their rifles till they got about 100 yards away. The other complication was the charge was uphill. They were focused more on the apse or this area of trees that they wanted to kind of stay in order from. But the high water mark of the Confederacy was this plaque right over here. They never got any farther than that. General Armistead, which was one of the Confederate generals, was the best man, I think, at General Hancock's wedding or vice versa. He got shot. He eventually died, but he asked about the well-being of General Hancock. General Hancock also got wounded. So after all that was done, around 11, 12 o'clock at night, Lee decided to retreat. He had 17 miles of wounded and prisoners. That was a lot to take off. We also remember on the 4th of July, Lee began his retreat. Vicksburg fell to General Grant. But there's another incident that occurred at Tebbs Bend on the Green River in Kentucky. General John Hunt Morgan, who was kind of like Mosby and his Rangers, wanted to go through Kentucky and into Ohio. But they ran across the 25th Michigan and about 250 of their men. So what they did, it was kind of like they had to go through a narrow pass, so they were well protected, and they just started picking them off as they were coming through. I'll talk a little bit about the Battle of Wilderness and Cold Harbor. The wilderness was a growth of trees that were cut down and new growth was in, and it was probably no bigger than your thigh. And there was brambles and bushes and pickers and whatnot going through there. This is what it looks like today, but what you see over here is a picture of sort of kind of what it was like then. And they said you couldn't see your enemy, you had to hear them. So at the Wilderness, that was the first time that the 24th cut and ran. They had about 260 new recruits. They had about 134 that survived Gettysburg, and they were part of the walking wounded. And imagine to have Stonewall Brigade come up behind you and start firing into your back. The new guys panicked and they ran. Now, the bad thing about it was 2 of the men were burnt to death. And if you tried to help them, you were easy targets. So there wasn't much you can do. Every once in a while, you'd hear a lone shot. The man committed suicide. Well, total of 19 men from the 24th were killed, 42 wounded, and 46 were taken prisoner. Typically, after a draw or a defeat like this, the Union Army would go back, lick its wounds, go to Washington, come up with a bigger and better plan. Not with General Grant in charge. There was a fork in the road. One led to Washington, one was after Lee. Grant, it said, rode up in there, blocked the road to Washington, and when the men realized what was going to happen, they cheered. Took away a lot of the surprise. Here is my perception of what the wilderness was like. You can see it's all a lot of small trees and brambles and bushes growing up, hard to get through. The next major fight was at Spotsylvania Courthouse. Here's a little rendering on one of those nice Civil War pictures that you'll see on the internet and can buy in Gettysburg. Now, a couple of things that I'd like to mention over here. They were involved, the 24th was involved in a charge up Laurel Hill. Too much firing, they were beaten back. The officers said, I don't believe that. Go and do that again. You guys can take them. So they charged up again with the same result. At the salient or the mule shoe, fighting continued. It was raining, mud, blood were spilled, and about 12 o'clock, a 22-inch oak tree, was cut in half by those Minie Balls and fell on some troops from South Carolina. That's 22 inches. That stump is in the Smithsonian Museum. Now, they suffered 24 killed, 41 wounded, and that left only 149 men in the regiment. They secured a place on the North Anna River, and they captured quite a few of the rebels. And then when they were brought behind lines, you few men captured all of these guys? It was almost unbelievable. Here's some of the medical equipment that a doctor would use. Now, a lot of people say, well, the Civil War was kind of barbaric. They did not have a lot of things going on for them. Well, they did not know about bacteria and germs, but they were kind of on the cusp of that. A guy by the name of Louis Pasteur proved that there was bacteria in wine shortly before the start of the Civil War, but he was way over in France. They had microscopes that they used. Towards the end of the war, they even trying to do transfusions. Now, their logic was, he's Irish, he'll get the blood from this Irish guy, so everything's going to be okay. Or he's German, and he get the blood from this German guy. Well, they didn't know about blood types, so it wasn't that successful. Their ambulance, where they also carried a lot of their medications and bandages, that style was used up to World War I. Now, the second thing that came into being was the Congressional Medal of Honor. Well, that was put together in 1862. Towards the end of 1863, they wrote a letter to each of the regiments saying, well, we want to award this Medal of Honor to those people who deserve it. Unfortunately, Major Hutchinson was the only one there at the time. Lieutenant Colonel Edwards and Colonel Morrow were away. And he said, I can't think of anybody more deserving than anybody else, so give it to the whole brigade. Well, guess what happened? They got nothing. Here's what the Congressional Medal of Honor looked like at that time. There was a gentleman by the name of Tom Custer that wore 2 of these Congressional Medals of Honor. You probably heard of his brother, George. Their final play was in the Siege of Petersburg. Now, at Petersburg, there was virtually no vegetation left. These are actual photos of what was going on. They had to import wood from Maryland. The other thing that happened was, well, what about the poor Confederates? They would sometimes go out at night and cut down what stumps were left that they could use. Another thing that I thought was mindful is if a soldier was emitting a bodily function, it was an unwritten rule, you did not shoot at them. But you can see how barren all of this was. They partook in Petersburg and the Wellington Railway, and they eventually got nailed down to 89 men left. They got reassigned to Camp Butler. But in between time, a gentleman that was in the brigade called Nelson Puller spent some time in Andersonville. I've never seen people so emaciated in all my life, except some of the Jews after the concentration camps in World War II. I will throw this back at them. They said, well, we couldn't get any food. Sherman marched 20 miles away, and his men were fat, dumb, and happy, so to speak. Now, each man, there was like 36,000 prisoners at Andersonville on 36 acres with a stream running through it. So that meant every man had an area of approximately 6 feet by 7 feet. There was no shelter. Sometimes they would put up sticks or anything they could find and drape a blanket, a scrap of cloth or anything that they could to provide them some shelter. But they were in the middle of a forest too. Well, our total of the death was 37 or 39% almost. 36,400 died in Confederate prisons. Another 23,006 died on the way home or shortly thereafter. Now, I got snookered with this one because they said that there was only 13.3% of the Confederates that died in Union prison. A couple things to keep in mind. They were not used to the bitter cold that you would get on Lake Erie or in upstate New York. The other thing was the Union soldiers were vaccinated against smallpox and some of the other. Not all of the Confederates were. I found out later that the Confederate prisoners was a little higher percentage than what I'm showing. So guess what happens? Come Palm Sunday, Lee surrendered. General Sheridan, with his cavalry, including General Custer, cut off his last supply of food. They were hungry, they were starving. So they made up just a little bit of a ditty over here about the epitaph. Gentle stranger, drop a tear. The CSA lies buried here. And youth had lived and prospered well, but soon like Lucifer, it fell. Its body's here, its soul in, well, Aaron, if I knew, I couldn't tell. Rest, CSA, from every strife. Your death is better than your life. And this one line shall grace your grave. Your death gave freedom to the slave. So we probably would do a little something like that too. Now this was April 9th. 5 days later at Ford's Theater, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. He survived to 7:22 the next morning. So imagine the jubilation you had and then the assassination of your leader. But 5 days later. Well, eventually his train was going to go to Springfield. This is the train station where he left Springfield and made a famous speech. This, they think, is the location of where his law office actually was. You can see the Lincoln Herndon law office is there. This is what his home looks like in Springfield. It was on the corner of 8th and Jackson Street. And not too far away was the old state capitol, where Lincoln came for the last time. They said they had over 75,000 men and women and children pass by his coffin. This is the train that he was brought in on. You notice that they have a picture over here, probably a green wreath, and then the rest of it was kind of with black crepe. You notice they weren't too bashful about being relaxed. You see the gentleman over here with his legs crossed. This hearse for Lincoln's body came all the way from St. Louis. Here is the only picture that I know of Lincoln lying in state. Secretary of War Stanton would not allow anybody to take a picture. Now imagine, these pictures at that time were done by a camera that weighed approximately 40 pounds, and he had to put it on a tripod, and he had to be still for 20 or 30 seconds. You would be noticed. So he put it in his writings and files. In about 1950, his heirs were started going through the files, and they found this picture of Abraham Lincoln there. One thing that I did find out is the mortician, this is Lincoln, shaved the sides of his face and cheeks and only left the hair on his chin. Here's Lincoln lying in state. It's a lithograph. And in my book, I will mention who the pallbearers are and what everything was talking about. This is what the temporary tomb looked like. And it's kind of a staging area before they buried people. But they allowed the president and his son to lie in state there until they got the big monument built. This is the monument that they have for Abraham Lincoln in the Springfield Cemetery, Oak Ridge. If any of you ever seen the advertisements for Illinois, and you see the picture of Lincoln there with the shiny nose, well, that's it, and that's kind of right out in front of the place. I'm going to give you some final statistics about the 24th Michigan. 173 were killed or died from wounds. Only 95 of these deaths came from disease. Typically, it was just the opposite. More than 2 times the people died from disease than died of wounds. 48 of the men died in Confederate prisons. 176 were wounded. 201 of them were disabled. So that gives us 615. They added 216 recruits after Gettysburg and 659 in Springfield. They were mustered out in Detroit on June 28th of '65. Here's some parting words from now Lieutenant Colonel Edwards. You are soon to return to civil life and assume the lives and duties and obligations of citizens. Your patience, promptness, courtesy, and fidelity have won for you the praise of your commanders. The story of your exploits will be told in history. And in your first battle at Fredericksburg, when only newly enlisted, you established a reputation for yourself for coolness and gallantry, which entitled you to be classed with veterans. Then he closes it with, let no act in your future life sully the fair name that you have won in the field. Return to your homes, good and quiet citizens, and follow the arts of peace with the same zeal and fidelity that you have shown on the field of honor. And happiness and prosperity will crown your lives. This was written by Lieutenant Colonel Edwards, who happened to be a student from the University of Michigan. A couple of closing things I wanted. This is from Orson Curtis's book. With many, their wounds disqualified them from their former occupation, and new pursuits must be planned. There was no weeping among the mortally wounded. The dying do not weep. Those destined to recover were too happy to indulge in tears. And this you'll find in Arlington Cemetery, not for fame or reward, not for place or rank, not lured by ambition or goaded by necessity, but in simple obedience to duty. As they understood it, these men sacrificed all, suffered all, dared all, and died. This is on a statue in the Confederate section of the cemetery. Now, one thing I'm very proud of, my book got an endorsement by the Republican president.